In the icy rush of a Wyoming river, a retired Marine dove in to save a wild Mustang fighting for its life. He thought the danger would end once they reached solid ground. He was wrong. What happened next on that muddy riverbank would defy everything he knew about wild horses and leave him questioning the line between instinct and something far more extraordinary. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. Ethan Cole had seen men break. He'd seen them fold under the white-hot sun of a desert he couldn't name, and he'd seen them shatter in jungles so wet your soul never truly dried. He'd been a Marine for the better part of a decade, and in that time he learned that everything has a breaking point. Machines, men, and the thin, fragile truce we call peace. His own breaking point had come in a flash of light and a sound so loud it became silence. A roadside bomb that sent shrapnel screaming through his right leg and his life off the rails. The wound left a jagged scar, a roadmap of pain that flared up when the weather turned cold. The doctors called the nightmares and the flinching at loud noises a mild case of PTSD. Ethan just called it the residue of a life he'd chosen. When the Corps sent him home with an honorable discharge and a permanent limp, he didn't know what to do with the quiet. Crowds felt like they were closing in, the noise of the city a constant grinding threat. He needed space. He needed a horizon big enough to swallow the memories. He found it in the ragged foothills of Wyoming, in a beat-up cabin miles from the nearest paved road. The roof leaked, the wiring was a fire hazard, but the silence was absolute. Out here, the only sounds were the wind in the tall prairie grass and the cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was his refuge. His days fell into a simple rhythm. He did seasonal work for the ranger service, mending fences and clearing trails, anything that kept him under the wide-open sky. Up before dawn, coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon, and long walks along the perimeter of his land. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was a life. It was his. That first week of April, winter was still clinging on with a mean, raw bite. Snowmelt from the Wind River Range was turning the Sweetwater River into a monster. The water was a churning, angry brown, swollen with silt and debris, undercutting its own banks and pulling whole sections of earth into the current. It was a beautiful, terrible thing to see, and it was a death trap for any animal that misjudged a crossing. It was on a morning just like that, with the roar of the river carrying on the wind, that his old friend Caleb Morgan gave him a call. Caleb was a ranger, a local who had stayed put while Ethan went off to see the world burn. "Got a stretch of fence I need to check before the river eats it." Caleb's voice crackled over the phone. "It's right along the Mustang range. Figured you could lend a hand." Ethan didn't hesitate. 20 minutes later, Caleb's old Chevy rattled into his yard, the truck bed loaded with fence posts, wire, and a heavy-duty climbing rope. They drove out toward the river, the truck bucking and swaying over muddy ruts. The sky was a washed-out gray, and the wind was cold enough to steal your breath. "Heard there's a band of Mustangs moving near the Sweetwater," Caleb said, his eyes on the treacherous road. "If they try to cross anywhere near this stretch—" He trailed off. Ethan knew what he meant. It could get ugly fast. They parked on a small rise overlooking the floodplain. From there you could see the full fury of the river. It was a terrifying spectacle of nature's raw power. Caleb pointed toward the fence line. "We'll check it east to west. Make sure nothing's come down." Ethan crouched to tighten his bootlaces, his gaze pulled to the churning water. For a second he thought he saw something. A flicker of movement that broke the pattern of the current. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. It was probably just a log. The fence line ran dangerously close to the riverbank, the posts leaning at crazy angles where the flood had eaten away the soil. Caleb was testing the tension on a wire when he suddenly froze, his head cocked toward the river. He lifted the binoculars hanging from his chest and scanned the downstream bend, where the water disappeared behind a stand of cottonwoods. He was still for a long, tense moment. Then, without a word, he handed the binoculars to Ethan. "Something's out there," he said, his voice tight, "floating." Ethan raised the binoculars. The powerful lenses brought the distant chaos into sharp focus. At first, all he could see was the churning brown water and white foam, but then he saw it, a patch of dark gray, bobbing and lurching in the current. It wasn't a log. Logs roll slowly, passively. This thing was fighting. It would disappear under the waves, then burst back to the surface with a frantic, desperate energy. Ethan twisted the focus ring. The image sharpened. It was a horse, a young stallion, his coat the color of ash, his mane a tangled, slick rope of debris and foam. His eyes were wide with terror, the whites showing all the way around. His legs were churning, but each kick seemed weaker than the last. "Mustang," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. Caleb let out a low whistle. He took the binoculars back, scanning the water around the stallion. There were no other horses. The herd was gone. They had either made it across or they had abandoned him to his fate. "He's alone," Caleb muttered. The current was dragging the stallion toward the center channel, toward a deep pocket where the water swirled into a brutal, grinding eddy. Ethan had seen it before. Anything that went into that eddy tired didn't come out alive. The horse was being pulled straight for it. "You know what happens if you try to get near that thing, right?" Caleb's voice was sharp. "That's a wild horse, Ethan. Even half drowned, it's got enough fight in it to kill you. One kick could snap your leg. He's panicked. He'll see you as another predator." Ethan didn't take his eyes off the struggling animal. The water was up to its neck now. It threw its head back, gasping for air, then plunged on. The fight was going out of it. The stallion's head dipped under the water, came up coughing, then went under again. Ethan felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He'd seen that look before, not on a horse, but on the faces of men in the moments before the end. It was the look of life giving up its claim. "Don't," Caleb said, seeing the look on Ethan's face. "If we wait another minute," Ethan said, his voice flat, "we'll be watching him float by belly up." Caleb's jaw was tight. "Ethan, this is suicide." But Ethan's mind was already made up. This animal wasn't just a victim of nature. A sudden warm spell had turned its home into a death trap overnight. It wasn't his fault. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. "If you're really doing this," Caleb said, his voice dropping, "we'll need the boat. And I'll be the one holding the line." Ethan finally looked at his friend. There was no argument in his eyes, just the same quiet, unshakable resolve that had carried him through a decade of war. "You're serious?" Caleb asked. Ethan gave a single sharp nod. "Yeah." Caleb let out a long, slow breath, a plume of white in the cold air. He jerked his head toward the truck. "Let's move," he said, "before I change my mind." They ran for the truck, the roar of the river at their backs. The image of the drowning stallion burned into their minds. They were running out of time. They raced back to the truck, their boots slipping in the wet gravel. Caleb's John boat was strapped to a trailer hitch, a small dented aluminum thing that had seen better days. But it was all they had. Caleb yanked the release lever, and the boat screeched down its skids. "Untie that bowline," he yelled over his shoulder. Ethan didn't hesitate. He unhooked the coiled rope and flung it clear as Caleb shoved the boat the last few feet into the raging river. The current immediately grabbed it, slapping cold water against the sides. Caleb jumped in, cranking the outboard motor. It sputtered once, coughed, and then roared to life. He held out a hand for the rescue rope. "This is climbing grade," he said, feeding the heavy line to Ethan. "Don't let it tangle." Ethan took the rope, looped it twice around his waist, and cinched it tight with a knot he could tie in his sleep. The other end, Caleb secured to a steel crossbar on the boat. He looked at Ethan, his eyes hard. "Last chance to change your mind." Ethan just glanced toward the drowning stallion. The fight was almost gone. "Not changing." "All right, listen to me," Caleb barked over the engine. "Don't come at him from behind. He'll kick your head off. Flank him. Keep your head low." "I'll go in at his shoulder," Ethan said, stripping off his heavy jacket. The wind bit at his bare arms, raising gooseflesh over old scars. He unclipped his multi-tool, checked the blade, and slid it into a sheath on his leg. If that rope snagged on something underwater, he'd have seconds to cut himself free. "You better come back with all your bones, Cole," Caleb said, his voice grim. "Just hold the boat steady." They pushed off. Caleb expertly spun the bow into the current, gunning the engine. The small boat bucked and strained, icy spray bursting over the sides, soaking Ethan to the bone before they'd even gone 20 feet. Caleb kept them just outside the main current, his eyes darting between the water ahead and the struggling horse. "He's losing his line," he shouted, currents pushing him toward the eddy. Ethan crouched at the bow, the rope tight in his hands. The cold was a physical thing, a crushing weight on his chest. The stallion was closer now. He could see the terror in its eyes, hear its ragged, desperate gasps for air. Caleb cut the throttle, letting the boat glide. The engine's roar dropped to a low burble. "This is you," he said. Ethan gave the knot at his waist one last tug, nodded once, and stepped off the bow into the freezing chaos. The river was a physical blow. The cold was so intense it felt like fire, seizing his lungs, stealing his breath. He surfaced with a gasp, the world a blur of brown water and grey sky. The rope around his waist went taut for a second. Caleb, holding him steady. Ethan started kicking, his powerful strokes cutting through the current. He kept his eyes locked on the stallion. Wild animals don't understand good intentions. They understand threat. So as he got closer, Ethan slowed his pace, letting the horse see him, letting it know he wasn't attacking. "Easy now," he called out, his voice low and calm. "Easy, buddy. I'm not here to hurt you." The stallion's ear twitched. Its eyes rolled, but it didn't lunge. It was too exhausted to fight, too focused on the simple, impossible task of breathing. When he was close enough to touch, Ethan reached out a hand and let it rest on the horse's neck, his fingers sinking into the wet, tangled mane. He didn't grip. He just anchored himself, a steady presence in the chaos. "Got you," he said quietly. The stallion shivered under his touch, but it didn't pull away. Its whole body was trembling, its ribs heaving. "Bring us around," Ethan yelled to Caleb. The boat's engine growled as Caleb maneuvered them, keeping parallel. Ethan started to push, guiding the massive animal toward a small sandbar he'd spotted, a tiny island of mud and sand in the middle of the river. It wasn't much, but it was their only hope. Every inch was a battle. The horse was a dead weight of soaked fur and muscle, and the river fought them for every foot of ground. Ethan's shoulders burned. The cold was seeping deep into his bones. But he kept his movements slow and deliberate, murmuring to the horse, his voice a constant calming presence. An unseen current grabbed his leg, spinning him around, almost tearing his hand from the stallion's mane. He held on, gritting his teeth. "Almost there," Caleb shouted from the boat. Then Ethan's foot touched sand. It was soft, shifting silt, but it was solid ground. He pushed harder, his calves screaming with effort, dragging himself and the stallion into the shallower water. The horse stumbled, its legs finding the bottom for what must have felt like the first time in an eternity. It lurched, then found its footing, and with a final desperate surge, it scrambled onto the sandbar. It stood there, head hanging low, its body shaking violently from cold and exhaustion. Ethan staggered up after it, his own knees threatening to buckle. He braced his hands on his thighs, sucking in ragged breaths of cold air. "Back off, Ethan." Caleb's voice was sharp from the boat. "Give him space before he decides you're the enemy." Ethan took a few careful steps back, keeping his hands open and his body language non-threatening. He was on a tiny sliver of mud in the middle of a raging river with a wild, terrified animal that could kill him with a single panicked kick. And he had absolutely no idea what it was going to do next. He stood there, shivering, his clothes plastered to his skin, the cold gnawing at him. The Mustang stood a few feet away, its sides heaving, steam rising from its wet coat. The wild panic in its eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. But it was watching him. One ear was swiveled in his direction, tracking his every move. Ethan didn't move a muscle. He just breathed, slowly, in and out. "Hold where you are," Caleb called from the boat. "Don't crowd him." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then something shifted. The stallion's head, which had been hanging low, lowered even further. The wet ropes of its mane slid forward. Its ears, which had been on high alert, tipped forward. Not in aggression, in curiosity. It took a step, then another. Slower, more deliberate this time. Like an animal approaching something it wants, but doesn't trust. Ethan held his breath. He didn't move. He let the horse close the distance. It stopped less than an arm's length away. It lifted its head, its dark eyes meeting Ethan's. There was no fear in them now, just a quiet, unnerving intelligence. Then the horse did something that defied all logic. It dipped its head, and gently, deliberately, it pressed its muzzle into Ethan's outstretched palm. It wasn't a nudge or a push, it was a touch, a connection. The warm, velvet-soft skin against his own. The horse let out a long, shuddering breath, a wave of warmth against his cold fingers. Ethan's heart was hammering against his ribs, but a strange calm settled over him. "Hey," he whispered, "you're all right." He didn't stroke it. He didn't try to hold it. He just let the moment happen. A retired Marine and a wild horse, sharing a small island of stillness in a world of chaos. "Cole," Caleb's voice was a strangled whisper from the boat. "I'm holding the line." "I know," Ethan said softly, his eyes never leaving the horse. For a few seconds more, they stood like that. Then, just as quietly as it had begun, the moment ended. The stallion lifted its head away. It blinked, flicked its ears, and turned its gaze toward the far riverbank, as if remembering that its journey wasn't over. "Okay," Ethan said, letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "We're not done." "Not by a long shot," Caleb replied, his voice tense. "That bar is dropping under your feet." Ethan looked down. The river was eating away at their tiny island, the water creeping higher with every passing second. They had to move. Now, but the next stage of the crossing would be even more dangerous than the first. And they were running out of time. Caleb was already reading the water. "Current's shifting," he yelled. "If you take him at a 45-degree angle, you can use the water to help you. Aim for that mud tongue below the cottonwoods. I'll keep the boat off your flank." He looked hard at Ethan. "And Ethan, don't get behind him. If he starts to kick, you let go. Don't be a hero." "I hear you," Ethan said. "Say it back to me." "I let go if he bolts," Ethan repeated, his eyes on the horse. Ethan turned his body toward the far bank, a clear signal of his intent. He didn't grab the horse's mane, he just held out his hand, an invitation. "Let's go," he said, his voice low and steady. "Come on." The Mustang stepped back into the water. Ethan moved alongside it, placing a hand on its shoulder, and they leaned into the current together. The river immediately tried to spin them, but Ethan kicked long and steady, his eyes on the horse's ears, reading its every twitch. The cold was brutal, stealing the strength from his limbs, but he kept the rhythm. Kick, breathe, check, murmur. He couldn't rush, or he'd spook the animal. He couldn't slow down, or the river would win. The boat shadowed them, a constant reassuring presence. Caleb's voice came in snatches over the roar of the water. "You're drifting. Correct left. Watch that log." The angled push started to work. The bank drew closer. Ethan's legs were screaming in protest. The old shrapnel wound in his thigh, a hot, throbbing ache. But he pushed on, just a little further. Then his boots touched the riverbed. It was treacherous, sliding silt, but it was a start. "Easy now," he gasped. "Don't rush it." The Mustang felt the bottom a second later. It lurched, found its footing, and scrambled the last few feet onto the muddy bank. Ethan let go, stumbling after it, his legs shaking. They stood there, two survivors, mud sucking at their ankles. The Mustang's head was low, water streaming from its coat. Ethan planted his hands on his thighs, fighting for breath, black spots dancing at the edge of his vision. They had made it. But as he stood there, catching his breath, he saw something was wrong. The stallion was holding its left foreleg off the ground, refusing to put weight on it. He squinted, his eyes tracing the line of the leg through the wet, matted hair. And then he saw it. Just above the fetlock, there was a patch of slick red-brown that wasn't just mud, and a dark, ugly swelling. "Caleb," he said, the word a ragged breath. "Front left." Caleb pushed the boat closer and squinted. "He's favoring it." It was more than favoring. Ethan took a slow, careful step to the side. The skin on the horse's leg twitched. Just below the swelling was a deep, ragged puncture wound, and across the back of the pastern there were faint, straight lines etched into the skin, too regular to be natural. "Barbed wire," Ethan said, a cold dread creeping into his voice. "He's been in it." Caleb swore under his breath, but as Ethan looked closer, something felt wrong. The wound wasn't just a simple tear. The edges were too straight in some places, too jagged in others. It didn't look like any wire injury he'd ever seen. It looked like something else, something worse. "We'll need Sarah," Ethan said, turning toward the boat. Caleb was already pulling the radio from his belt. As he called in their coordinates, Ethan stayed perfectly still, his eyes locked on the strange wound. Help was coming, but a terrifying thought was taking root in his mind. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. Caleb clipped the radio back to his belt. "She's 20 minutes out," he said, bringing the full kit. Ethan didn't move. He kept his voice low, the same calm tone he'd used in the river. He gave the horse a few minutes of stillness, letting it know the danger was over. Only when its breathing steadied did Ethan move, inching sideways toward its shoulder. "Just want to look," he said, slow and easy. The stallion's ears twitched, but it didn't move away. Ethan started with the safe places, his palm resting lightly on its withers, letting the horse get used to his touch. Then he slowly slid his hand down its neck, down its shoulder, his fingers tracing the lines of muscle and tendon. The skin quivered but held still. When his fingers reached the swollen area, he stopped. He didn't touch the wound itself. He circled it, feeling the unnatural heat radiating from it. A thin, foul-smelling fluid was weeping from the puncture, the smell of infection. He rocked back on his heels. "We're not waiting on this," he said quietly to Caleb. "If that infection sets in, he's done for." I told Sarah to hurry. 20 minutes later, a ranger truck appeared over the rise. Dr. Sarah Whitmore stepped out, a medical pack slung over her shoulder. She took in the scene, man, horse, river, boat, with a single incredulous glance. "I'm going to say the thing you already know," she said, her eyes on the Mustang. "This is not normal." "Hi to you too," Caleb said, a hint of relief in his voice. Sarah stopped a safe distance away. "Talk to me," she said, all business. "Front left," Ethan told her, "puncture, swelling and heat. He let me look, but not touch the wound itself. He's been cooperative." "He let you look," she repeated as if she couldn't quite believe it. "All right, I'll use a low-dose sedative, just enough to take the edge off." She assembled a short-range dart gun. "If he jumps, you let him go. I'd rather do this twice than have someone get trampled." "I'm not holding him," Ethan said. "I'll just stay where he can see me." Sarah approached in a shallow arc. Ethan stood his ground, a familiar anchor point for the horse. At 10 feet, she fired. The soft pop of the dart gun was barely audible over the river. The dart hit the horse high on the rump. It twitched, half-turned, then stilled as Ethan murmured to it, "Good boy, stay with me." The sedative took hold quickly. The horse's head drooped, its eyes grew glassy. Sarah snapped on a pair of gloves. "I'll clean. Caleb, you mind the leg." She trimmed away the matted hair around the wound with precise, gentle movements. Then she flushed it with warm saline, washing away the mud and filth. The puncture was deeper than it looked, and at the bottom something glinted. "Hold," Sarah said quietly. Using a fine pair of forceps, she reached into the wound and carefully teased out a small, twisted piece of metal. It wasn't a barb from a fence. It was a fragment of something else. Something sharp and serrated. A piece of a jaw trap. She dropped it into a steel tray with a sharp clink. "This wasn't an accident," she said, her voice grim. "Someone set a trap out here." She administered a powerful antibiotic and an anti-inflammatory, then she pulled out a rugged collar with a small transmitter. "It'll ping us his location a few times a day," she explained. "It has a breakaway clasp, so it won't get snagged." "I've got his attention," Ethan said softly. He stepped closer, letting the Mustang see his hands. "We're almost done," he told it. "Then you can go." Sarah slid the collar around its neck and clicked it shut. They backed away, giving the horse space. A few minutes passed. The sedative began to wear off. The horse blinked, shifted its weight, and tested the injured leg. It tossed its head, as if shaking off a bad dream. Then it turned and looked straight at Ethan. There was a clear, undeniable intelligence in its gaze, a flicker of recognition. "Go on," Ethan said quietly. The Mustang took a step. The injured leg held. It took another, then broke into a slow, careful trot, mud flying from its hooves. At the edge of the clearing, it paused and looked back, its ears forward, its eyes on Ethan. Ethan gave a small nod. The horse turned and disappeared into the tall grass. A grey ghost, swallowed by the landscape. 15 years I've been working with wild horses, Sarah said, shaking her head. I have never seen anything like that. Ethan didn't answer. He was watching the place where the horse had vanished. This was no longer just a rescue. Someone was illegally trapping on this land. And they had just made a very powerful, very determined enemy. The first ping from the collar came in before the mud had even dried on their boots. Back at the ranger station, a small green dot pulsed on a satellite map. He was in a north pasture, not far from the river. Alive, mobile. For the next few days, the dot told a story of survival. The Mustang, who they now just called the Grey, kept to a small, contained area. He didn't try to rejoin a herd. He stayed on the edges, away from the competition and the challenges of the bigger, more aggressive stallions. It was classic convalescent behavior. He was smart. He was conserving his energy, letting his body heal. Every evening, Ethan would drive out to an overlook and watch the flats through his binoculars, catching a glimpse of a grey shape moving through the tall grass as the sun went down. The horse was alive. He was choosing to live. On the 5th day, the collar showed him making a brief push toward one of the northern herds, then retreating. He tested the waters and thought better of it, Caleb said, looking at the map. Smart, Sarah replied. He's not wasting energy he doesn't have. The days fell into a new rhythm. Check the map, drive to the overlook, watch, wait. It became an obsession for Ethan. He felt a strange connection to this animal, a bond forged in the chaos of the river. He had saved the horse's life, and now he felt a fierce, protective responsibility for it. On the 10th morning, Ethan was out in his yard, mending a fence, when his phone buzzed. It was Caleb. He'd missed 2 calls already. Yeah? Ethan answered. You need to get to North Ridge. Caleb's voice was breathless, urgent. Right now. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. That's the problem. Our grey friend, he's standing in the open with company. And I swear to God, Ethan, just get here. Ethan dropped his hammer and was in his truck in seconds, spraying gravel as he peeled out of his driveway. He pushed the old Chevy harder than he should have, his mind racing. What could be so strange that it would make Caleb, a man who'd seen everything the Wyoming wilderness could throw at him, sound so spooked? When he got to the crest of North Ridge, Caleb was already there, binoculars pressed to his face. He didn't turn as Ethan approached. He just handed him the binoculars. Look, he said, his voice a low whisper. Ethan raised the glass. In the middle of a wide meadow below them stood the Grey. He looked stronger, healthier. The slump of exhaustion was gone from his spine, and he wasn't alone. A few yards away stood a bigger, older stallion, his shoulders covered in old scars. And in the shade of some cottonwoods, 2 mares watched warily. The Grey was on the edge of the small herd, a tolerated outsider. But that wasn't what had Caleb so rattled. Look at his feet, Caleb said. At the Grey's feet lay a small, waterlogged carcass. A yearling pronghorn, drowned in the flood. Coyotes should have found it by now. Ravens were circling overhead. But the Grey wasn't eating it. He wasn't touching it. He was standing over it, guarding it. What's he doing? Ethan asked. Something I can't explain, Caleb said. He's just been standing there. The big stallion won't go near it. The mares won't come in. It's like they're waiting for a signal. From him. Twice the older stallion took a step toward the carcass, and twice it stopped, its ears cocked toward the Grey, as if listening to something they couldn't hear. Caleb's voice dropped even lower. Does it look like he's waiting for us? Ethan didn't answer. He lowered the binoculars, his mind reeling. The horse wasn't just waiting, he was holding the carcass for them. It was a gift. A thank you. An invitation. It was impossible. But it was happening. Call Sarah, Ethan said, his voice tight. Tell her it's the best chance she's going to get to give him that booster shot. They moved down the ridge carefully, using the willows and cottonwoods for cover. Sarah arrived as they reached the edge of the meadow. She peered through the trees at the bizarre scene. You weren't kidding, she whispered. That's an adult stallion at his shoulder. This could get very dangerous, very fast. We're not wasting this chance, Caleb insisted. Sarah nodded, pulling a plastic tub and a sealed jar from her satchel. Pelleted antibiotics and anti-inflammatories, she explained. They smell like a pharmacy, which is why I brought this. She shook the jar. Molasses. It turns the medicine into something a horse can't resist. A spoonful of sugar, Caleb grinned. Precisely, Sarah said. The trick is getting it to the grey without the dominant stallion deciding it's his. She looked at Ethan. He knows you. You have to be the one to put it down. Ethan nodded. Sarah mixed the pellets into the sticky molasses, scooping the mixture into a shallow rubber pan. She handed Ethan a long, slender fiberglass pole with a U-shaped cradle on the end. For reach, she said. If he objects, you can drop the pan and get out of there fast. Ethan took the pole and stepped out into the open. He didn't walk in a straight line. He moved in a slow, shallow arc, keeping his shoulders turned and his eyes mostly on the ground, a non-threatening posture. He could feel the horse's attention on him, a heavy, palpable weight. The grey stood his ground, a silent sentinel over the dead pronghorn. At 20 feet, Ethan stopped. He lifted the pole slowly, the pan of medicated molasses held out in front of him. Got something for you, he said, his voice a low murmur. He extended the pole and gently set the pan on the ground, a few feet from the pronghorn, closer to the grey than to any of the other horses. Then he drew the pole back and took 3 slow steps backward, his hands open at his sides. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then the grey shifted its weight. It stretched out its neck, sampling the air above the pan. Its nostrils flared. Then it stepped forward and began to eat. It wasn't rushed. It was slow, deliberate, and with every other mouthful, it would lift its head and look directly at Ethan. Not with fear, not with aggression. It was a look of confirmation, a look of trust. The big stallion watched, but made no move to interfere. The mares relaxed, their bodies sinking into a resting posture. A raven swooped low, and the grey's ears shot back, a silent, sharp warning that sent the bird flapping away. Look at that, Caleb breathed from the willows. He's sharing the kill with us. It's not a kill, Sarah murmured. It's an arrangement. When the pan was empty, the grey lifted its head. It looked at Ethan one last time, then turned to the dead pronghorn and made a soft, low, whickering sound. The older stallion took this as his cue and stepped forward to feed. The mares followed. Ethan backed away slowly, his heart pounding. The horse hadn't just trusted him. It had somehow communicated with the other horses, making them wait, making them understand that these humans were not a threat. It was a level of intelligence, of communication, that shouldn't have been possible. As he reached the willows, Sarah whispered, "Dosage in, clean as a lab. I'll take a dozen miracles like that, please." They watched for a few more minutes. The grey turned away from the carcass, its role in the strange transaction complete. It walked to the edge of the meadow, stood with its head high, and looked out over the Sweetwater River, the river that had almost claimed its life. "See ya," Ethan said under his breath. They left the way they came, moving backward, like friends departing, not intruders fleeing. As they reached the trucks, Caleb finally spoke the question that was hanging in the air. "You think he knew what we were doing?" Ethan thought about the scene in the meadow, the way the grey had looked at him between mouthfuls of medicated feed. "Knowing is a human word," he said, "but he understood enough." Enough for what? For both of us to keep our promises. What he didn't say was that this strange, impossible connection was growing stronger, and he had a feeling that the grey wasn't just thanking him. He was trying to show him something else, something hidden out in the vast, wild landscape. Caleb's video went viral within the small, dedicated community of the Wyoming Mustang Conservation Project. The 2-minute clip, raw and unedited, showed the whole incredible scene. The comments section exploded. Some argued it had to be a trained horse, a domestic animal that had gone feral. Others claimed it was just an anomaly, a result of the animal's exhaustion and pain. But a very few, saw something else. They talked about social memory, about reciprocity behavior, about a level of intelligence in wild horses that science was only just beginning to understand. Ethan read all the theories, all the arguments, but none of them captured the truth of what had happened out there. It wasn't data. It wasn't an incident to be catalogued. It was a conversation without words, a recognition. And it was just the beginning. The pings from the collar started to change. The grey's territory expanded. He was moving with more confidence now, his leg clearly healing. But the pattern of his movements was strange. Every 2 days, like clockwork, he would travel to a remote, rocky outcrop on the far side of the basin, an area with little grazing and no easy access to water. He would stay there for a few hours, then return to his usual grazing grounds. "What's he doing out there?" Caleb asked, tracing the horse's path on the satellite map. "There's nothing in that canyon for him." "Maybe he's just exploring his range," Sarah suggested. But Ethan didn't think so. There was a purpose to the horse's movements, a strange, repeating pattern. It was a map, and the grey was trying to show them where to go. "We're going out there," Ethan said, "tomorrow morning." They set out at dawn, following the GPS coordinates from the collar. The truck could only take them so far. The rest of the way was on foot, a grueling hike through rough, unforgiving terrain. The canyon was a maze of narrow passages and steep, rocky walls. "You really think he came all the way out here?" Caleb said, breathing hard as they scrambled over a pile of fallen rock. "The data doesn't lie," Ethan replied. After nearly 2 hours of hiking, they found it. Tucked away in a small, hidden alcove, almost invisible from the main canyon trail, was a crude makeshift camp. A dirty tarp was stretched between two rock faces. A small, blackened fire ring held the ashes of a recent fire, and scattered around the camp were the telltale signs of a poacher. Wire snares, a small pile of pronghorn hides, and several large, brutal-looking jaw traps, the same kind that had torn into the grey's leg. One of the traps had been recently used. There were dark, dried bloodstains on the metal jaws and a few strands of coarse grey hair. The horse hadn't been exploring. He'd been returning to the scene of the crime, over and over again. He wasn't just showing them where the poacher was. He was trying to lead them to the man who had hurt him. "Son of a bitch," Caleb whispered, his hand resting on the butt of his sidearm. "He's still active." As they stood there, taking in the scene, Ethan heard a sound. A faint clink of metal against rock coming from further up the canyon. Someone was coming. They ducked behind a large boulder, their hearts pounding. A minute later, a man appeared. He was big and burly, with a grizzled beard and cold, dead eyes. He was carrying a rifle and a heavy canvas sack. He walked into the camp, dropped the sack on the ground, and began to reset one of the traps. It was him, the poacher. But they were two unarmed men, miles from their truck, and he had a rifle. They were trapped. As the poacher worked, Ethan's mind raced. His marine training took over. Assess the threat, find an advantage, create a diversion. But what could they do? Suddenly, another sound echoed through the canyon, the thunder of hoofbeats, dozens of them, coming fast. The poacher froze, his head snapping up. From the mouth of the canyon, a herd of wild Mustangs appeared, galloping at full speed, their manes flying, their eyes wide. And at the head of the herd, running with a strength and grace that defied his recent injury, was the grey. The poacher fumbled for his rifle, but it was too late. The herd was on him. They didn't trample him. They flowed around him like a river around a rock, a terrifying, beautiful stampede of wild energy. The sheer force of their passage kicked up a storm of dust and rock, disorienting the poacher, forcing him to stumble back, his rifle clattering to the ground. In that moment of chaos, Ethan and Caleb moved. They burst from behind the boulder, tackling the poacher, wrestling him to the ground. The fight was short and brutal, but the element of surprise was on their side. Within seconds, the poacher was subdued, his hands zip-tied behind his back. As the dust settled, the herd disappeared up the canyon, their hoofbeats fading into the distance, but one horse remained. The grey. He stood at the edge of the clearing, watching them, his sides heaving, his dark eyes calm and intelligent. He had done it. He had brought the herd. He had created the diversion. He had led them to this exact spot, at this exact moment, to deliver justice. It was a coordinated, intelligent act that shattered every known rule about animal behavior. It was a miracle. And it had saved their lives. They marched the poacher back to the truck, a long, silent hike through the rugged canyon. The man, whose name they learned was Jedediah Kane, was a notorious local troublemaker who had been operating off the grid for years, wanted on warrants in 2 different states. The evidence in his camp was more than enough to put him away for a long, long time. As they drove him back to town, Ethan kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the grey following them. But the wild landscape was empty. The horse had done its part. The rest was up to them. The story of the rescue, the poacher, and the incredible intelligent Mustang became a local legend. The video Caleb had taken, combined with the bodycam footage from the arrest, made national news. Scientists and animal behaviorists came from all over the country to study the Mustangs of the Sweetwater Basin, trying to understand what had happened. They wrote papers filled with theories and jargon, but none of them could ever truly explain it. How could a wild horse, an animal driven by instinct, orchestrate such a complex, deliberate plan? How could it communicate a need for help, lead its rescuers to its attacker, and then summon its herd to create a perfectly timed diversion? It was a question without an answer. It was a miracle that defied explanation. A year passed. The seasons turned. Ethan's life settled back into its quiet rhythm, but something inside him had changed. The residue of the war was still there, but it didn't have the same hold on him. The silence of Wyoming no longer felt empty. It felt full of a wild, ancient wisdom he was only just beginning to understand. One spring morning, almost a year to the day since the rescue, Ethan was guiding a small group of donors along the river. The water was high but calm, the banks a vibrant electric green. He was explaining how the cottonwoods anchored the soil when he saw a flicker of movement on the far bank. A grey shape stepped out of the tall grass. It was him. The stallion's coat was sleek and healthy, his body filled out with muscle. He walked to the water's edge and stopped, no more than 50 yards away. He looked directly at Ethan. The group of donors fell silent, watching the powerful, magnificent animal. For a long moment, man and horse held each other's gaze across the quiet water. Then the grey did something remarkable. He lowered his head, a slow, deliberate movement, until his chin almost touched his chest. It wasn't a gesture of submission. In the complex social language of the herd, it was a sign of respect, an acknowledgement given between equals. It was a gesture of profound, incredible trust. Ethan felt his own head incline in return, a small, almost imperceptible nod. A smile touched his lips. The grey straightened, turned, and walked back into the grass, disappearing as quickly as he had come. One of the donors, a woman with a walking stick, spoke in a hushed whisper. That's the horse from the story, isn't it?" Ethan kept his eyes on the place where the grey had vanished. "Some things," he said, his voice quiet, "don't need explaining." He had gone to the river that day to save a life, but in the end, in a way he never could have expected, the wild, intelligent, impossible horse had saved him right back. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.